Okay.
Okay. Okay. Parshas Toldos. Uh, Parshas Toldos talks about Yitzchak, and about Yitzchak's two sons, Yaakov and Eisav, and it tells us about Yitzchak, that Eisav sells the Bechorah, the birthright, to Yaakov, and ultimately Yitzchak decides to give the brachos, the blessings, to Eisav and Rivka, knowing that Eisav was not deserving of the brachos, and that Eisav could never fulfill the shoes to replace Yitzchak and Avram as the Avos, as the patriarchs of the Jewish people. She manipulates that Yaakov should get the brachos. And the question that is always asked is, why is it that Yitzchak thought that Eisav was deserving of the brachos? It's true, Yitzchak was blind, but nevertheless, even though he did not have the ability, because of his handicap, to realize the wickedness, the degree of wickedness of Eisav, he certainly should have understood that Yaakov was more deserving of the brachos, that Yaakov would fulfill that position of being the patriarch of Klal Yisrael, whereas Eisav was not capable of filling that position. Yaakov was an Ishtam, according to our sages. He was sitting in the Olo Shel Shem Ve'ever. He was sitting in the tents of Torah, of learning, of studying. And whereas an Eisav was an Ish Hasada, a man of the fields, who would just go out to the fields, our sages tell us, and just shoot arrows at whatever passed by, whether it was animals or human beings. So how is it that Yaakov did not recognize that Eisav would never be able to fulfill that function of being an Av of Klal Yisrael, being a patriarch of the Jewish people? Now, there is a pshat that's suggested by many. I thought of it, and then it was pointed out to me that my father mentions it. I probably heard it from my father when I was younger. And I think the same pshat is said in the name of my uncle, with each one saying it with differences. And it's possible, I think that might have heard that some version of this was said by the Beis Halevi as well, and by many others. Everybody says it over a little differently. Details are different, but the general idea is more or less the same. And that is that it was Yitzchak certainly did not know the extent of Esav's wickedness. And of course, Yitzchak, Ahavas, he loved Eisav, as the Torah itself testifies. It says, Kitzayit befiv. And our sages tell us how Eisav used to trick Avram with all kinds of false questions, indicating that he had a drive, a desire for spirituality. He would ask the question, Eich Ma'asrin es HaMelech, how do we take off Meiser? How do we take off the tithe from salt? And of course, salt is something that there is no need to take off a tithe, to take off Meiser. But he wanted to give the impression to Yitzchak that not only he was observant, but he had a desire to even be more religious, more observant. And Yitzchak, because of his blindness, physical blindness, he wasn't able to see. The Medrash mentions that condition, he got that condition as a result of the Akedah. So the Medrash says that when he was in the Akedah, the Malachim cried. Obviously, this Medrash can't be taken literally. The Malachim cried, and the tears of the Malachim fell on the angels, fell on the eyes of Yitzchak, and ultimately that led to Yitzchak's blindness. I would think that perhaps the idea was that the Akedah, making Yitzchak a korban, a sacrifice, necessitated in some way his removal from the mundane and physical world. And even though initially Yitzchak, even after the Akedah, was involved in the mundane world, as the simple explanation of Vayetze Yitzchak l'suach b'sada, that Yitzchak went out to the field either to check about the possessions that he and Avram had in the field, as some explain it, or as some explain, to talk to people in the fields. But eventually became necessary because of his high spiritual state, in a sense, partially to remove him from this physical mundane world. And when he was overcome with blindness, his involvement in the mundane and physical world became somewhat limited. So Yitzchak, as a result of this blindness, was not so aware of the falsehood, of the false impression that Eisav was trying to give him about himself. But nevertheless, Yitzchak certainly would recognize Yaakov's superior spiritual state. And it was Yitzchak's desire, I think, to create a relationship between Yaakov and Eisav. Torah tells us that HaKadosh Baruch Hu told Abraham, Ki v'Yitzchak yilkara l'chazara. From Yitzchak will be your descendants. And our sages tell us, Ki v'Yitzchak yilkara l'chazara. From Yitzchak will be your descendants. Below Kol Yitzchak. Not all of Yitzchak. In other words, only one of Yitzchak's sons will become the real successor for generations to Abraham and Yitzchak. But Yitzchak understood the words Ki v'Yitzchak likar l'chazara, from Yitzchak or in Yitzchak. In other words, all of Yitzchak will be considered the descendants of Abraham and Yitzchak. And he faced a certain dilemma. On one hand, Yaakov was a total spiritual person. Yaakov was a Yoshev Oholim. He didn't leave the tent, and it was a tent of Torah. He wasn't involved with people. He did not have those leadership qualities that are necessary, certainly on a mundane level, and perhaps to a certain degree necessary also on a spiritual level, to be a leader. On the other hand, Eisav, although Yitzchak did not recognize the extent of Eisav's wickedness, or he did not recognize Eisav's wickedness, but he probably understood, one would think, that he understood that that Eisav, the hunter, was not a total spiritual being, certainly not like Yaakov. And perhaps it was Yitzchak's plan to create a union, an alliance between Yaakov and Eisav. Yaakov, the spiritual person, had the capabilities of turning into a spiritual leader. Right now, perhaps he did not have those leadership qualities, but he had the spiritual foundation and the leadership qualities to a certain degree within a religious realm, within a spiritual realm, could be acquired. But there was a necessity, Yitzchak perhaps felt, to there was a necessity for Yaakov there was a necessity for the Jewish people, for the successors of Abraham and Yitzchak, to have someone that had qualities of mundane leadership. There were times that Avraham and Yitzchak had to deal with Avimelech, that had to deal with outside enemies. And sometimes with people who were friendly, but were not part of Avram's and Yitzchak's spiritual group. And Yitzchak felt that Yaakov, although he had those spiritual qualities, Yaakov had the spiritual qualities, like, so to say, using an example like the Kohen Gadol, the spiritual leader of the Jewish people. But Eisav was more suited to have the leadership qualities that are associated with Malchus, that are associated with king, with being a king. And to a certain degree, when Yaakov and Eisav years later meet, Yaakov, in order to impress upon Eisav not to wage war against him, not to destroy his camp, he refers to Eisav as Adoni Eisav, my master Eisav. He even talks about eventually coming to see Eisav in Seir. The truth of the matter is, we see that although initially Eisav tells Yaakov that he will accompany him in his road back, Yaakov says, I can only go slowly. He does not want to go with Eisav, knowing that there could not be an alliance. But he tries to give Eisav the impression that even in their separation, there will be some sort of alliance, in order to realize that his taking of the brachos, at least in Eisav's lifetime, did not have any impact on the way things turned out. So it's Adoni Eisav. And the truth is that Eisav himself was not that interested on a permanent level of being together with Yaakov, even for small periods of time. Torah tells us that Eisav leaves Eretz Yisrael and goes to Seir. Till then, he was in both places, the way some of the Parshas pointed out. He spent time in Seir, he spent time in Eretz Yisrael. But once Yaakov comes to Eretz Yisrael, Mipnei Yaakov Achiv, he wants to separate. He wants to separate himself. He doesn't want to be subject to the spirituality. But Yitzchak's plan was to make an alliance between Yaakov and Eisav. And Rivka, Eisav perhaps wanted an alliance from afar, in which he would be the master, he would be the Adam. Rivka understood that there couldn't be any alliance. There couldn't be an alliance with Eisav. Even from the point, Vayisrotzu habanim b'kirba, from the point where, according to many of the Mefarshim, there was intense fighting, figuratively perhaps, while she was pregnant, between the two twins that she was carrying, Yaakov and Eisav. And it's the way some of the Mefarshim explained in some of the Midrashim, that each one was trying to kill the other one. And as I discussed it last year, Eisav wanting to kill Yaakov, we know. Halacha she'Eisav sonei liYaakov. It was expressive of the future. It was expressive of the fact that there is a hatred, there is a disposition in Eisav of hatred against Yaakov. It's not that they don't have the ability to overcome that disposition. And sometimes they overcome that disposition for short periods of time. And sometimes it's for lengthy periods of time. And that they're able to overcome. There are certain people that are very moral. And when they think intellectually, and they're motivated by their intellectual evaluation, they're able to overcome the disposition, the psychological disposition of hatred that they might possess. So, but Rivka understood the natural inclination, and not just of Eisav, but of Eisav's descendants, is Eisav sonei liYaakov. Eisav always tries to interfere with Yaakov. Sometimes when the interference with Yaakov sometimes not only is bad for Yaakov, but it's bad for Eisav as well. How many times do we see that some leaders in the Vatican, that the Pope talks against the Jewish people and in favor of the murderers among the Muslims? And what does that show? And these same Muslims, while they might make temporary alliances with some Christian groups, sometimes these same Muslims kill and massacre Christians as well. But nevertheless, that doesn't stop the Vatican for trying to give the impression that the Jewish people are causing like a Holocaust in Gaza. Why are they doing that? Perhaps, and not just perhaps, to make a distraction from the history of the Vatican during World War II. Now, there are many in the Christian faith who have supported and continue to support Israel. But the successors to Eisav today are found in many European countries. where they refuse to evaluate intellectually. They're found in the UN, the United Nations. The peace organization, the organization that supposedly is dedicated to bring peace to the world, and whose workers we have found out were involved in the October 7th events of murder and rape. And the response of the UN, it was only a few. And so Rivka understood, as a result of the words of the Navi who she went to, that it's Eisav son of Yaakov. There could never be an alliance. At best, there could be separation. And if there is something worked out temporarily, it wasn't that long ago that we remember that there was a call from the Vatican to have ecumenical meetings to discuss religious matters common to both religions. And at that time, my uncle Zatzal took a very strong stand against such activity. I think deep down, and I think it's obvious that my uncle understood that the true nature, well, first of all, it's not something that we have to be involved in altogether under the best of circumstances. But he saw it as a grave danger for the Jewish people. He saw it as, if we're not to blind ourselves, not physically blind ourselves. Yitzchak was physically blind, but he wasn't mentally blind. But there are people, even among our own ranks, that want to be mentally, that make themselves mentally blind. And in spite of everything that's happening, that they're capable of seeing, they make believe that they don't see it. They give all kinds of excuses. But there are those who, like Rivka, understand that there can't be a union. Yes, we can be friendly. Yes, we can be respectful. But we can't have trust. We cannot give over trust of our future generations to those who falsely accuse us of the crimes that they enabled against the Jewish people. And their accusation, they're accusing us, is only to whitewash, to hide what they did or what they didn't do during World War II. So Rivka, who was not blind, and she saw how Eisav was misleading Yitzchak giving him false impressions. And knowing that Eisav Sonei Yaakov, and Yaakov, the Medrash seems to say that Eisav was trying to kill Yaakov. At least that was the impression that Rivka had. And Yaakov was trying to kill Eisav. That probably represented, that was a sign of the future. That Yaakov, there's a Habal Laharcha, as I've mentioned many times, Hashkem Lahargo, that Yaakov's has to be on guard. And he has to fight back. Because if he doesn't fight back, if he doesn't demonstrate his strength, then there will be a Holocaust. And when the Jewish people were not capable of demonstrating their strength, there was pogroms and there was Holocausts. And one demonstration of strength against the Jewish people leads to another demonstration of strength against the Jewish people. And then we have some Mayofis Jews who try to play both sides, who are fearful of the vote that their brothers might not cast on their behalf. When they run for election. So, but they want to advance their political careers. So they try to play both sides. So what they'll do is they won't say it's the fault of the Jewish people, but they'll say it's the fault of the leaders of the Jewish people. I am sympathetic to the Jewish people. I am sympathetic to Israel, but its leadership is no good. They have no right to defend themselves. Of course, they won't phrase it that way. They'll say, yes, you can defend yourself against the soldiers, but not if the soldiers are in houses where there are people. Not if the missiles are in houses where there are people. And it makes no difference that these people were enablers that cheered the October 7th participants, that hid the hostages. And then they say, now if someone shoots me and that person raises his child against the bullet as a shield, who killed the child? The one who shot the gun to save his life? Or the murderer who used his son as a shield? If Arab children are dying, they are dying because they're being used as shields. And they talk about food and water, the UN. They talk about food and water. Israel doesn't let food and water come in. Even though it's well known that the food and water very rarely and only to a small degree reaches the public in Gaza. It's all taken by the soldiers of Hamas. But then again, it seems that these people have no way of bringing food and water into Gaza. Somehow we're able to have people deliver rockets and all kinds of ammunition into Gaza. Why is it that those who make the deliveries of the rockets are not capable of bringing the water and the food into Gaza? Do you mean to say that the Israelis only try to interfere with the food and the water, but they give free pass to letting the rockets in? And you know something? There will probably be some fool at the UN that might eventually, as a result of saying such nonsense, be elected to the head as one of the leaders of the United Nations. So this is the Eisav Sonel Yaakov, which is a tradition among the descendants of Eisav. And so this was the reason, but Yaakov wanted to create an alliance, and he did not fully comprehend Esav's wickedness, and he was fooled to a certain degree. And he felt, yes, Eisav is lacking a certain degree of spirituality. But together with Yaakov, if he works together with Yaakov, so Kiva Yitzchak Yilkar Lechazara, from Yitzchak will be all your descendants. And it's interesting, there are midrashim that say that originally Rivka and Yitzchak should have had 12 shvatim. So they saw themselves perhaps as being the avanein of the whole and their children being the whole next generation of the Jewish people. Ultimately, it was only 2, but they saw them because they had that. Yitzchak saw those 2 as being the perpetuation of the Jewish people. But I think there is another possibility to explain why Yitzchak wanted to give the brachos to Eisav. It's very interesting when the Torah describes Eisav. The Torah says right at the beginning of Parshas Toldos, Vayigdalu hanarim vayi Eisav ish yodei etzayed ish soda. Eisav was a man of the fields; he would hunt. Yaakov ish tam yoshev alen, and Yaakov was a wholesome man, complete person, abiding in tents is the way the English translation. Intense, just say tense of Torah. He was sitting and studying, he was learning, he was involved in spirituality. So Eisav was a man of the fields. Now it's very interesting, the Torah tells us at the end of Parshas Chayesara that Yitzchak, Vayetze Yitzchak L'suach B'sada. And there are all kinds of explanations. The explanation of Chazal is Vayetze Yitzchak L'suach B'sada, that Yitzchak went to daven. Yitzchak tikein tfilas mincha. He davened mincha. He instituted the davening of mincha. There are some Rishonim that explain the Gemara in Yuma that actually Abraham, even before Yitzchak, davened mincha, but he didn't institute it as a tefillah, whereas Yitzchak instituted it by his example as a tefillah. And So, but where did Yitzchak go to daven? Yitzchak went besada. He went into the fields. The question is, why did he go to the fields to daven? Why couldn't he? Yaakov, when he davened Ma'ariv, Yifka b'makom, it was the site of the Beis Hamikdash. It was on base scale. He sensed there was something spiritual about the place. And Abraham, Vayashkem Abram Baboker El Hamakom, to the place. Asher Amad Sham Berishona was the place where he talked with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Perhaps where he davened to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, where he pleaded on behalf of the people of Sdom. And Makom is the name of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, one of the names of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Usually it means Makom is associated with being somewhat distant from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but creating a relationship. We say in Yom HaKippurim, Al Das HaMakom, Al Das HaKol, Anu Matirim Lehispalim of our Harvayonim. When there are sinners among us, HaKadosh Baruch Hu lets us make a connection with him anyway. So, but there is a distance, and God gives us the ability to somehow overcome that distance and connect with him. When time of tragedy, we say Hamakom Yenachem. In a sense, the person just had a tragedy. He prayed, he davened, he pleaded with God on behalf of his relatives. But for whatever reason, his prayers were not answered. And there is a certain distance. He feels that perhaps there's a certain distance. And he tries to overcome that distance, to come closer. We say then, Hamakom Yenachem Eschem. So Makom is usually used in overcoming, in establishing a relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, when we are somewhat distant from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Yitzchak, I think, because he was an Ola Tamid, he was an Ola Tamim, he was a completely spiritual person. He was put on the Mizbeach, on the altar. So he didn't have that distance. As a matter of fact, and that was the reason for the physical world is a curtain that sometimes hides God. And Yitzchak was able to penetrate that curtain. But in a sense, at the same time, his being blind limited his involvement in the physical world. And by Yetze Yitzchak L'such B'Sada, why? Because in regard to Abbas Hashem, we're told that you can search for God in nature. And it's very interesting. There are people that study science, that look at nature, and they see the presence of God. And that creates a special bond between them and HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Whereas scientists who, on the contrary, using their areas of profession, their areas of knowledge, create a curtain that hides God. They use nature as a curtain to hide God. If one wants, he could penetrate nature. Not only penetrate nature, but nature could strengthen his feelings of closeness to God. But if one wants, they could use nature as a barrier that separates them from God. And Yitzchak was a man of closeness. He was on the Mizbeach, one who is on the altar. He was a carbon. He was given to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. He was given over to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. He had that sense of closeness. Yes, Abraham and Yaakov also had a sense of closeness. But only Yitzchak was a carbon. Yitzchak had this greater sense of closeness. He had this special sense of Dusha. And because of that, when he went to daven because that's where he was able to feel that closeness to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And he was able to penetrate the nature, not only to penetrate nature, but for him, nature brought him closer to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Nature not only gave him the ability to recognize the existence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but that's where he felt closest to God. And that was the psychology of Yitzchak. And the Yitzchak, knowing that Eisav was an Issasada, and hearing the questions of Eisav, and not being physically able to see the actual activities of Eisav because of his blindness that hid him to a certain degree from the physical world. So he sensed that why did Eisav find comfort in being Besada? Because when he was Besada, whatever he was doing there, whether it was davening, which Eisav certainly didn't do, but Yitzchak did not know that, or even when he did other things, the Chol Drachecha Dehu was Yitzchak's perspective. Wherever you go, you have to have a relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Whatever you did, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is there. But Eisav used the Sada not to feel closer to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Eisav used the Sada to be further away from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So it was the combination of these two things that caused Yaakov to make the mistake of giving. In other words, he wanted to create an alliance, and he thought there could be an alliance. He felt that Eisav also had a degree of spirituality, that Eisav also wanted. Why was he always besada? Because he, like Yitzchak, felt closer to HaKadosh Baruch Hu in the Sada. But it was true. Yitzchak was more mundane. Yitzchak wasn't sitting and learning. Yitzchak wasn't sitting Boel. He wasn't the Yoshe Baalin. But Eisav. Eisav was not Yoshe Boel. Eisav was not Yoshe Boel. Eisav was not sitting and learning. Yitzchak, of course, was a mistake. Eisav was not sitting and learning. Eisav was not Boel. But why did he want to be besada? Because he felt close to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So he felt that there was a common ground, that they could make an alliance between Yaakov and Eisav, and they both could provide jointly the leadership of future generations for their descendants of Abraham and Yitzchak. So he wanted to give the mundane bracha, the mundane bracha, mitala shemaim mishmane aretz. The mundane bracha he wanted to give to Eisav. And the spiritual bracha, v'yitein lecha es birchas Abraham, he wanted to give to Yaakov. But Rivka understood that there couldn't be an alliance. Eisav was a person who would trade the Bechorah for a pot of lentil soup. And why? Because the lentil soup was there in front of him. Eisav did not have any sense of spirituality. Everything was fraudulent. The spirituality was fraudulent. And because of that, Rivka manipulated that Eisav should not get the brachos, and the Yaakov should get both brachos. But Yaakov had to learn how to go out to the Sada, how to deal with a Lavan. And as the Rambam in Moreh Nevuchim says, and the Psukim of next week's Sedra, when there was a Sulam Mutzavartza Verosha Magia Hashemayma, Umalachei Elahim Olim V'Yardim, and he says, who is the Malachei? Moreh Nevuchim says, the angels of God that climbed the ladder to heaven and then went down to earth. Those are the Nevi'im, the prophets, the agents of God. And they have to climb up the ladder to heaven spiritually to perfect themselves. But after they perfect themselves, they have to go down to fulfill their mission. Yaakov in the tent was climbing the spiritual ladder. But there came a time for him to leave the tent, to be the patriarch of Klal Yisrael. You have to at some times leave the tent. You have to know what is going on with the people. You have to recognize their problems. Unfortunately, lately, some of the statements that are being made by leaders of the Torah community, while it's expressive of them having never left the tent, but it shows that they're not always aware of everything that's going on. Even in the frum community, they don't understand. They don't understand how important the service of those who are fighting on behalf of Klal Yisrael and on behalf of the yeshiva boys also. And they issue statements that indicate that they don't appreciate the work, the sacrifices that they are making on behalf of the Jewish people, and including the yeshiva boys. And they utter all kinds of nonsense, that they don't need the army. They will be protected. For some reason, they're not aware of all the acts of terrorism that was brought about not just against the secular Jews, but against the religious Jews. How people were killed in shuls. Great London were murdered. But they ignore those facts. And they certainly don't remember history. 1929, Hebron. Why? The boys in Hebron, they weren't sitting and learning. And they rejected, at that time, there was an offer of having guards, of using military equipment, of having guns there because of the unrest among the Arabs. And they said that they didn't need it, the people in Hebron. Their relationship was good. They didn't understand the concept of Eisav Sonei Yaakov, that there might be temporary relationships. But if you think long term, Eisav Sonei Yaakov, some of Eisav, not all of Eisav. There are those that are able to overcome those dispositions. And there are those that really show love towards the Jewish people. They show appreciation to the Jewish people, that are working on behalf of the Jewish people. But there are many that unfortunately, at moment's notice, they could have been your best friend yesterday. And today, certainly in Israel, they will come in Israel, they will come in and murder you. And even in the United States, we have some of that. Not saying everybody, majority of the people probably are not that way. But what goes on in the college campuses, I mentioned before, people call me, they say some of their best friends now don't talk to them. Not only they don't talk to them, but we see people on the news, it's reported, there are many in the left wing of American life that are telling people that Thanksgiving, they should not associate with their relatives that supported those who supported the state of Israel. They don't phrase it that way, but that's what it amounts to. Many organizations, businesses, I've been told, businesses that give give charitable contributions to charities that their workers designate. We're told this year they can't give the charity to Friends of IDF. What do the Friends of IDF do? The IDF is the ones who are fighting in defense of war. The Friends of IDF aren't buying guns. They're not buying rockets. Perhaps they're buying blankets. Perhaps they're buying coats. Perhaps they're creating places for soldiers who are giving their lives, protecting men, women, and children. And sometimes Arab men and women and children, I should add. For them to be able to have a rest of some sort. And yet the government of the United States, who always claims that they're supporting Israel, but always threatens them that if you think that you're allowed to go in to save yourselves, to bomb the sites where rockets are placed in houses, then we will cut off all our help from you. So this government has somehow given the word to companies to encourage them not to give the charities that are directed towards the friends of the IDF. This is what I was given over. And many companies, perhaps not as a result of government pressure. There are cases where the companies say that it was the government that did it. And others perhaps will do it on their own. Yesterday, they had no problems. Yesterday being more than a year ago, they had no problems doing it. But Eisav Sonei Yaakov, it doesn't always come out, but it comes out sometimes, and we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. And we have to bear that in mind. We have to bear in mind that it's important to be aware of the feelings, the emotions of the Jewish people, of all the Jewish people. To sense their fears, to know why there are fears, and to recognize their contribution, their legitimate contribution, not only to their community, but to all the communities, including the yeshivish community. If not for them protecting the Jewish people, do you think even one yeshiva would survive in face of the Arab forces? The Arabs fight each other, kill each other. You think they would let the Jewish people continue to have yeshivas? But like I say, there's physical blindness and there is mental blindness. Mental blindness is a self-inflicted disease. Physical blindness is something that happens. And unfortunately, there are many in our community that have a self-afflicted disease of mental blindness. It's time for Pokei Chivrim. We have to open our eyes. We have to recognize the facts. And we have to recognize every group of Jewish people should recognize the contribution that the other group has for them. The soldiers should recognize the contribution of those who are learning and davening on their behalf, and those who are learning and davening on their behalf should recognize the contribution of those who are giving their lives to protect them.
Okay, so there are a few questions. Just before I mention the questions, there's probably no share next Sunday.
That's right.
So several people asked this two exact same questions. One question being, why didn't Abraham tell Yitzchak that Eisav was no good? And why didn't Rivka tell...
well, first of all, where did I say that Abraham knew Eisav was no good?
No, they're asking Stam. Why didn't Abraham recognize that and tell Yitzchak?
Huh?
The Chazal say that Eisav was a good boy until...
No. The answer is it was not revealed to Abraham. First of all, it was not revealed to Abraham which one of the sons will be the continuation. Secondly, we don't know that Abraham was told to tell him, and Yitzchak, Eisav, especially in view of the fact that Eisav perhaps could have, at least as far as Abraham was concerned, Eisav could have joined Yaakov. The one who was not chosen could have joined the one who was chosen to join with them, accepting him as the leader of the group. As a matter of fact, the Medrash says that Yaakov was somewhat punished because he was scared that Eisav might marry Dinah, and he was punished because that might have caused Eisav to do tshuva.
What about Rivka not telling Yitzchak about it? What Eisav was really like.
So that question is addressed by the Mefarshim, but there are two answers that can be given. What the Mefarshim say is that Rivka didn't tell because, inasmuch as Yitzchak didn't know, as Yitzchak, it was clear that Yitzchak didn't know, and she did know. So she felt it was a message that was given only to her and not to be given over to Yitzchak. That's one answer. That's the answer the Mefarshim give. And the second answer is that maybe she just didn't. She wanted to do it herself because she didn't want to aggravate him. That is something that could also be suggested.
If Yitzchak was so kadosh, so are you saying it's almost like a nevuah, and so
Yeah,
and it wasn't supposed to be given to Yitzchak?
that's correct.
Okay. A different question is if Yitzchak was such a kadosh, couldn't he sense the lack of kedusha in Eisav?
uh, my sense is that a Navi is able to sense what Hakadosh Baruch Hu allows him to sense, and going with this idea that that it had to be done in this way. This also was part of the training of Yaakov, In other words, Yaakov, as a Yoshev Olim, would be hesitant to fight Eisav. This was the beginning of the training of Yaakov to leave the tent, to deal with the real world, and to be able to defend himself, to acquire the skills to defend himself against Eisav. That's why it's Vayisrotzu to Abanim Bekirba. That was the message of Vayisrotzu. Eisav wanted to kill Yaakov because Eisav Sone Yaakov. But Yaakov wanted to kill Eisav. The impression given by the Medrash was, I assume, it's because there is a mitzvah of self-defense. We have to rise up. First of all, by Amalek, there's certainly a mitzvah. But even where we're dealing with the other children of Eisav, Habal laharcha, hashkem lahargo. Part of that message of Vayisrotz to Haban Bekirba is we can't be idle. We have to fight back. We have to prevent the Jewish people from being killed. Any other questions?
No, I don't think so. So why didn't Yaakov then kill Eliphaz in self-defense?
Huh? Well, Eliphaz didn't come to kill him. Eliphaz, on the contrary, he just told it was a question of what he should report back to Eisav. So he reported back to Eisav that he was poor man and Ari Chashiv Kames.
Okay. So have a good week, everyone, and no share next Sunday on what is it, December 1st? But we'll send an email anyway, and then
Yeah.
the next week.